The coffin is halfway down the shaft when the rope begins to slip. Men above pull backward. Men below raise their lamps and move away from the wall. The painted wood turns slowly in the darkness, scraping against stone, while dust falls onto the people waiting beneath it. Someone calls for the rope to be held. Someone else calls for more slack. Inside the coffin is a king. He had once crossed the Nile in a royal procession. Priests had burned incense before him. Soldiers, officials, mourners and servants had followed his body into the desert. His tomb had been cut for years. Its walls had been painted with gods, spells, gates, stars, and the roads of the next world. That tomb is now somewhere behind them. It has been opened. Perhaps it has already been robbed. The king is leaving the eternal house made for him, and no one intends to take him back. When the coffin reaches the bottom, the men turn it into a narrow passage. They carry it deeper beneath the cliffs, past other coffins, past other kings, into a hiding place that belongs to none of them. Then they return for another. Tonight, we are going back to the Valley of the Kings, but not to the moment when the valley was new, not to the age when the first workmen climbed into the western hills with copper tools, baskets, lamps, and careful plans, and not to the grand funerals, when a dead king crossed the Nile beneath bright sails and entered the desert surrounded by priests, soldiers, officials, incense, and gold. We are going there later, much later. The ceremonies are over. The mourners are gone. The temple doors have closed. The king has been placed inside his stone coffin, and the men who knew the path to the burial chamber have returned to their village. The entrance has been filled. The seals have been pressed into wet plaster. The names of the king have been spoken one last time in the dark. And for a while, everything works as intended. The tomb is hidden. The cult continues. Priests bring offerings to the king's memorial temple. His image remains on the walls. His name is repeated by people who never saw him alive. The body lies still beneath the mountain. That is the version of the Valley of the Kings we usually imagine, a place of sealed rooms, a silent city of the dead. Each king alone inside his private eternity, protected by spells, stone, distance, and fear. But the royal tombs did not remain sealed. Most were opened in antiquity, some by thieves, and some by officials conducting inspections. Some were repaired, emptied, reused, or abandoned. And some of the kings themselves were taken out, carried through the night, and hidden together in places they had never chosen. The dead did not stay where they had been buried. This story is often told as a crime story. There are tunnels, stolen gold, secret markets, informers, interrogations, and written confessions. There are officials who accuse one another, guards who may have looked away, and men who knew exactly how thick a tomb wall could be. But the robberies did not begin with one clever thief standing outside a royal tomb. They began before that. They began when a kingdom that had built monuments for eternity became less able to feed the living people who maintained them. So before we enter the robbed tombs, we need to remain outside for a while. We need to look at the villages, granaries, temples, river, and men waiting for wages that did not arrive. Because a royal burial could be protected only while the world around it continued to function. And by the end of the new kingdom, that world was becoming difficult to hold together. There was no single morning when Egypt woke and discovered that the new kingdom was over. Empires rarely end that neatly. The temples still stood. The Nile still rose and fell. Scribes continued to date documents by the regnal year of the pharaoh. Officials still used old titles, and artists still carved the king larger than everyone around him. The language of power remained confident. But confidence on a wall is not the same thing as control on the ground. During the reign of Rameses III, Egypt fought costly wars against Libyan groups, and the enemies remembered in Egyptian inscriptions as the Sea Peoples. At Medinet Habu, the scenes are ordered, crowded, and certain. The king stands above the confusion. Foreign soldiers fall, Egyptian chariots advance, and the gods approve. Egypt survived those wars, but survival was expensive. Armies had to be gathered and supplied, fortifications had to be maintained, temples and royal building projects continued to consume labor and material. Officials, soldiers, priests and workers all depended on systems that moved grain, oil, cloth, fish, vegetables, firewood and other goods across the country. The state did not normally pay the royal tomb workers with coins. Coinage had not yet become part of ordinary Egyptian economic life. The workers were paid mainly in rations. Grain was the foundation. It became bread and beer fed a household, and could also be exchanged for other things. Alongside it came deliveries that might include oil, fish, vegetables, clothing, firewood, and ointment. This meant that wages were not merely numbers in an account. They had to move physically. Fields had to produce, granaries had to receive, scribes had to count, boats had to carry, storehouses had to release, officials had to approve, and guards had to protect. And someone, at the end of the chain, had to place the ration into the hands of a waiting worker. When any part of that chain failed, the worker could not feed his family with a promise. The surviving records from the late New Kingdom do not allow us to reduce Egypt's problems to one cause. There were wars and political struggles. There were local shortages, delayed deliveries, corruption, and administrative weakness. Grain prices rose sharply during parts of the later Ramesside period. Royal authority became less dependable, especially far from the residents in the north. The temples still controlled land, personnel, workshops, and stored goods. At Thebes, the institution of Amun became increasingly powerful. The king still ruled Egypt, but the institutions around him did not always move as one body. A country may look unified in its official art while becoming fragmented in practice. The pharaoh's name might appear everywhere, while a mayor, high priest, military commander, or local administrator controlled food, workers, guards, and information in his own area. And in the west of Thebes, just beyond the cultivated land, there was a small community whose entire purpose depended on the state keeping its promises. The modern name is Deir el-Medina. The people who lived there called their settlement the Place of Truth. It stood in a dry hollow on the west bank of the Nile, between the green fields and the royal valleys. The village was enclosed by a wall. Its houses were narrow and close together, their rooms following one another from the entrance toward the back. Stairs led to roofs where people could work, store things, talk, and sleep beneath the night air. This was not a camp of disposable laborers. It was a community of highly skilled state employees and their families. The men cut, shaped, plastered, painted, and inscribed the tombs of kings and queens. Some were stonecutters or draftsmen, while others prepared pigments or carved hieroglyphs. Foremen supervised the crew. Scribes recorded attendance, supplies, disputes, deliveries, and work completed. The workforce was divided into two sides, usually translated as the left and right sides of the crew. Together, they worked through the royal tomb like the two sides of a ship's company. Their work demanded precision. A mistake in a house wall could be repaired and hidden. A mistake in the tomb of a king might remain beneath the mountain forever. The men knew how a royal tomb was planned. They knew how corridors changed direction, where doorways were sealed, how chambers were cut, and how debris concealed an entrance. They knew the difference between ordinary limestone and a wall that had been plastered over. They knew which tools would bite into stone, how smoke gathered in a narrow passage, and how long an oil lamp might last underground. They also knew the sacred meaning of what they built. Their own village was filled with household religion. They prepared tombs for themselves in the nearby hills. They left prayers, letters, jokes, sketches, complaints, contracts, lists, and private thoughts on pieces of limestone and broken pottery. Because the dry climate preserved so much writing, Deir el-Medina allows us to hear ordinary life with unusual clarity. We know when workers were absent. Some were ill, some were caring for relatives. Some were brewing beer, repairing houses, making offerings, or dealing with problems that sound surprisingly familiar. The records show arguments, debts, marriages, inheritance disputes, friendships, and accusations. They were not anonymous hands. They had names and families, and they worried about food. And they lived close enough to the royal tombs to see the difference between the wealth prepared for the dead and the uncertainty experienced by the living. For generations, the arrangement had worked. The state supported the village because the village performed a task essential to royal ideology. A king required a tomb. The tomb required trained men. The trained men required food. It was a simple relationship only when the rations arrived. During the reign of Ramesses III, delays became harder to ignore. The workers waited, then they complained, and then they waited again. The grain ration was not a gift from a generous ruler. It was the wage owed for their labor. The men who built eternity were being asked to continue working on credit. In the 29th year of Ramesses III, the delay became a protest. The event survives in the document now known as the Turin Strike Papyrus. It was written in hieratic by the necropolis scribe Amenakte, a man close enough to both the workers and the administration to record what happened. The papyrus does not sound like a legend. That is part of its power. It gives dates, records movement, and names officials. It tells us where the crew sat down, who spoke to them, what was offered, and why the men refused to return quietly to work. On the 10th day of the second month of the inundation season, the workers passed the guard posts of the royal necropolis. They left the controlled space where they were expected to remain, and they shouted that they were hungry. They said that 18 days had already passed in the month. Then they sat down behind the mortuary temple of Thutmose III. The location mattered. A mortuary temple was not simply a religious building. It was also an economic institution connected to land, storage, personnel, offerings, and distribution. By leaving their workplace and sitting near a temple, the workers made themselves visible at a place where food and authority met. Officials came to them. The men were told to return. They did not. They moved again, turning the protest into a series of sit-ins around the temples of the Western Bank. Their words were practical. Hunger and thirst had brought them out. They lacked the supplies that normally supported their households. They asked for their complaint to be written to the pharaoh and the vizier. That detail is easy to pass over. They did not begin by rejecting the system. They appealed to it. They believed, or at least said, that the king should be told. The failure might belong to officials, storehouses, or administrators below him. Perhaps the pharaoh did not know that the men working on the royal tomb had not been paid, so they asked that their words travel upward. This is often called the first recorded labor strike in history. It is more careful to call it the earliest surviving strike documented in such detail. Other workers must have stopped work before them. Most of those moments disappeared without a scribe. This one did not. We can follow the men from place to place. We can see officials attempting to calm them. We can see partial payments offered, old rations released, promises made, and work resumed only for the problem to return. The strike was not one clean event with a beginning, a victory, and an ending. It repeated. A delivery arrived, but it was not enough. The men returned. then stopped again. An official spoke but could not solve the larger problem. Grain was found and distributed, the immediate hunger eased, and the machinery began moving. Then it failed once more. At one point, the workers explained that their protest was not only about hunger. Wrong had been done. In Egyptian thought, order was not merely the absence of noise. The world was meant to function through balance, obligation, and proper conduct. A ruler upheld order, officials carried it out, workers performed their assigned tasks, the gods received offerings, and the dead received remembrance. When wages failed repeatedly, the problem was larger than an empty bowl. The relationship itself had been damaged. The workers had kept their side. The state had not kept its own. Imagine one of those men returning to Deir el-Medina in the evening. He has spent years cutting passages for a king who may never speak his name. His hands are rough from tools. Fine dust remains in his clothing. He knows that somewhere inside the mountain, chambers are being prepared for furniture, jewelry, amulets, linen, oils, vessels, and precious metal. He enters a small house where his family is waiting. The grain has not arrived. It would be easy to turn that moment into a moral lesson, to say that hunger led directly to robbery. But history is rarely so obedient. The men who went on strike were not necessarily the men who later robbed royal tombs. Deir el-Medina was not simply a village of future thieves. Many residents served honestly. Many protected the necropolis. Known robbery networks also included people from outside the village: stoneworkers, fishermen, farmers, temple employees, guards, traders, and others. Still, the strike reveals a change. The royal necropolis could no longer assume that its workers would be fed on time. The state had failed in public, and the failure had been written down. Once a system begins to fail, people learn new things about it. They learn which official has no grain. They learn which temple storehouse still does. They learn that a royal order may arrive late, or not at all. They learn that guards can be passed. They learn that sacred work stops when ordinary food disappears. And they learn that the institutions surrounding the king are not eternal. By the late 20th dynasty, control over the western necropolis was thinning. The village still existed, scribes still kept records, and crews still worked. But supplies became irregular, political power shifted, and the royal building program weakened. Eventually, the community at Deir el-Medina was abandoned as the traditional royal necropolis ceased to function in the old way. The tombs remained, but the system that had created and protected them was changing. And a tomb is only secret while enough people agree to keep it secret. The burials had one weakness. They had been made by human hands. A sealed doorway could be opened. A blocked passage could be cleared. A wall could be tunneled through. The people capable of doing it did not need to believe that the king had no power. They only needed to believe that the guards, officials, and courts had less power than before. So we go in with them, not through the entrance used during the funeral, through a hole cut in the dark. Tomb robbery was not invented at the end of the New Kingdom. Egyptian graves had been robbed for as long as valuable things had been placed inside them. A burial gathered wealth into one enclosed space. Even a modest grave might contain linen, vessels, tools, jewelry, food, or amulets. A royal burial could contain materials that most people would never hold in their lives. Gold did not decay. That was part of its sacred beauty and part of the danger. The Egyptians associated gold with the flesh of the gods. In a royal burial, it could cover coffins, shrines, jewelry, fingers, toes, amulets, and ceremonial objects. Outside the tomb, gold became something simpler. It could be cut, weighed, and melted. Once melted, the face of a king disappeared. a sacred object, became metal. This is one reason tomb robbery was rarely the work of a single desperate man. Someone had to know where to enter. Someone had to break stone or timber. Someone had to provide tools and light. Someone had to move the stolen material without attracting attention. Someone had to sell, exchange, hide, or melt it. The surviving robbery records reveal networks that crossed social boundaries. Thieves dealt with traders, guards, temple personnel, craftsmen, and local residents. Stolen metal entered ordinary economic life. It could be exchanged for land, animals, food, or goods. The dead king's burial became part of the living market. There is something strange in that transformation. A bracelet made for a royal body might be divided among men who had never entered a palace. A sheet of gold hammered for a coffin might later pass through a merchant's hand as an anonymous weight. A sacred amulet might lose its name and disappear into a workshop. Nothing about the metal itself announced where it had come from once its form was gone. The thieves understood this. Some robberies required repeated effort and detailed knowledge. Tombs were cut into rock, closed with blocking stones, sealed, plastered, hidden beneath debris and watched by necropolis guards. To enter one, a group might dig from above, cut through a side wall, reopen an old shaft, or follow a passage disturbed by earlier intruders. The work was dangerous. A tunnel could collapse, a lamp could fail, a guard could hear stone breaking, or an accomplice could talk. And beyond the practical danger was the religious one. The thieves were not entering an empty treasury. They were touching a transformed body surrounded by spells, gods, and warnings. But fear can change shape when a system weakens. A man may fear the dead king and still fear hunger more. He may believe the tomb is sacred and still tell himself that someone else will rob it if he does not. He may enter once, survive, and discover that the silence inside the chamber feels no different afterward. The first successful robbery teaches a lesson that no official can easily erase. The king did not rise. The mountain did not close. The gold could be carried away. By the reign of Ramesses IX, reports of robberies in the Theban necropolis had become serious enough to produce a formal investigation. That investigation survives in the Abbot papyrus, and like many official records, it tells us about more than the crime it was meant to examine. The Abbot papyrus dates to the 16th year of Ramesses IX. It records inspections carried out on the west bank of Thebes after accusations that tombs had been violated. The conflict involved two powerful local officials. Parsa was mayor of the eastern side of Thebes. Pharaohs was mayor of the western side, which included the royal necropolis and its guards. Parsa accused the Western administration of failing to protect the tombs. That accusation was not small. If royal graves had been robbed under Pharaohs' authority, the crime could become evidence of corruption, incompetence, or complicity. The broken coffin of a dead king could damage the career of a living mayor. A commission was assembled, and Pharaohs was part of it. The man whose administration stood accused took part in the inquiry into the accusation. Officials went into the desert to inspect the tombs named in the reports. The papyrus records the process with administrative calm. A tomb is located, its condition is described, its seals, passage, chamber, or burial are examined. Then a judgment is made, intact or violated. The list included royal tombs, burials of important women associated with the temple establishment, and private tombs. Most of the royal tombs examined were reported intact. One was not. The tomb of King Sobekemsaf had been broken into. Sobekemsaf belonged to a much earlier age, centuries before Ramesses IX. His burial was described as a pyramid tomb in an older royal cemetery within the Theban landscape. The inspectors found that thieves had tunneled into it. The king and his royal wife had been attacked in death, Their burial equipment had been stripped. Private tombs nearby had also suffered heavily. This might appear to settle the argument in Parsa's favor. A royal tomb really had been robbed, but Parsa had made wider accusations. The commission reported that many royal tombs he claimed were violated were still sealed or otherwise judged intact. Only part of the accusation was confirmed. Pharaohs' administration could present the inspection as proof that Pesa had exaggerated. A noisy procession followed, directed toward Pesa's side of the city. The political message was clear. Pharaoh had survived the inquiry, and his rival had been embarrassed. This is one reason the Abbot Papyrus is so valuable. It is a record of tomb robbery. It is also a political document. The dead were evidence in a dispute between the living. An intact seal could protect a mayor. A broken burial could be used against him. The inspectors were supposed to establish the truth, but truth entered a world of careers, rivalries, and institutional loyalties. We should not assume that every official lied. We should also not assume that the papyrus gives us a neutral view from above. Administrative records are written by people inside the system they describe. The surviving account appears favorable to Pharaoh. It emphasizes the many tombs found intact and the weakness of the broader charge. Yet it also confirms that robbery was real, extensive in parts of the cemetery, and capable of reaching a king. The violated tomb of Sobekemsaf became the center of another surviving record. The inspection had found the wound. The interrogation would try to find the hands that made it. Among the accused was a quarryman or stonemason, usually called Amen Panufa. He worked in the wider temple and labor world of Thebes. He was not a wandering stranger who happened to discover a royal burial. According to the surviving testimony, he and 7 companions knew what they were doing. The robbery had taken place several years before the case was recorded. The men went to the pyramid tomb of Sobekemsaf. They brought copper tools. They cut and tunneled until they reached the burial chamber. We cannot recover every detail of that night. The papyrus gives us legal testimony, not the private memory of a frightened man. It records words produced after arrest and interrogation. Still, the physical sequence is clear enough. First came the stone, the repeated sound of tools, dust in lamplight, a narrow opening and air moving from a sealed space. Then came the chamber. The king lay inside with his queen. The robbers opened the burial and stripped precious material from the royal bodies and equipment. The confession speaks of gold, silver, bronze, amulets, ornaments, and other valuables. Then the men divided what they had taken. A royal eternity became shares. Each man received a portion. That division suggests planning and temporary trust. 8 men could enter together, but once the treasure was outside, each man became a danger to the others. Someone might hide part of his share. Someone might boast. Someone might spend too quickly. A wife might ask where the gold came from. A neighbor might notice new animals, new land, or unusual purchases. A trader might understand that the metal had come from a burial. This is where the crime expanded beyond the tomb. Gold had to move through people. The tomb was hidden in the desert, but the stolen wealth entered villages, houses, workshops, boats, and markets. Every exchange created another witness. Every accomplice created another possible confession. For a time, the men escaped. That mattered. They had survived the tomb and the guards, and they had spent the metal. The success of one group could encourage another. News did not need to be announced publicly. It could travel as rumor. There is gold in the western hills. The guards can be avoided. This tomb has already been opened. That official can be paid. That trader asks no questions. The state's problem was no longer one robbed burial. It was knowledge. The surviving court records are vivid, but they are not comfortable documents. Interrogation in ancient Egypt could involve physical violence. Suspects and witnesses were beaten. The texts refer to blows on the hands and feet, including beating with a double rod. Oaths were imposed. Statements were compared. Accused men could be taken to the site to reconstruct the crime. A confession cannot therefore be treated as a transparent window into the past. A man in pain may tell the truth. He may also say what he believes will stop the pain. He may accuse an enemy. He may repeat a story suggested by officials. He may admit to one crime while hiding another. The robbery papyri sometimes preserve contradictions that reveal this pressure. A suspect confesses, then withdraws. A witness names someone, then changes his account. Officials compare details, order further punishment, or send men to inspect a location. The record can feel procedural and brutal at the same time. Amenhotep's statement is unusually detailed. He describes entering the tomb with companions. He describes finding the king and queen. He describes removing precious material. He describes dividing the gold. The account agrees broadly with the physical finding that the tomb had been violated. Yet we still have to hear it through the conditions in which it was produced. The scribe did not sit beside Amenhotep as a friendly listener. This was not a memoir. It was testimony extracted within a system that used pain as an investigative tool. The punishment for violating a royal tomb could be death. For the court, tomb robbery was more than theft from a wealthy dead person. It was an attack on royal property, sacred order, burial, and the continued existence of a king in the next world. The thieves had not merely taken metal. They had unwrapped bodies. They had removed amulets placed to protect the dead. They had damaged names and equipment prepared for transformation. They had turned a divine king into material. The papyri sometimes refer to a dead king as a god. This makes the language of the confession more unsettling. The robber speaks of stripping gold from the august mummy of this god. The sentence contains belief and violation together. Perhaps Amenhotep believed the king was divine. Perhaps he used the legal language expected of him. Perhaps both were true. People do not always stop believing before they do something forbidden. Sometimes they carry the belief with them into the crime. The court wanted names, and Amenhotep gave them. The investigators wanted a sequence, and he gave them one. The authorities wanted stolen property recovered, networks exposed, and responsibility assigned. The records show how difficult that could be. Precious metal was easily divided and transformed. Years might pass between a robbery and an arrest. Suspects could disappear. Accomplices could die. Guards and officials might protect themselves. No single papyrus gives us the whole archive. The surviving documents are fragments from a larger process. Some sections are lost. Some trials are known only through references elsewhere. Dates and relationships remain debated, but together the records show that the thefts were not isolated. By the end of the 20th dynasty, and during the troubled years around Ramesses XI, authorities repeatedly investigated robberies of tombs and temple property. The old royal cemetery was becoming impossible to secure. The state could arrest men, extract confessions, and punish thieves. But it could not restore secrecy to a landscape whose paths, shafts, chambers, and weaknesses were already known. There was another problem. Some of the people ordered to inspect, repair, and relocate the royal dead had access to the same wealth the thieves wanted. An official party might open a damaged tomb to protect the mummy. They might remove the body, renew its wrappings, place it in a different coffin, and move it to a safer place. But what happened to the gold that remained? What happened to the jewelry, furniture, and burial equipment? Was it preserved for the king, returned to a temple treasury, reused for another burial, taken during the operation? The records do not always allow a simple answer. The later restoration of the royal mummies was not necessarily a pure act of protection. Rescue and appropriation could occur in the same operation. A mummy might be rewrapped with care while its original burial equipment was dismantled. By the final years of the New Kingdom, the old arrangement had failed. The king could no longer rely on a private tomb, hidden entrance, sealed chamber, and permanent guard. The solution would be radical. Officials would stop trying to keep every pharaoh inside the tomb prepared for him. They would open the tombs themselves. They would identify the bodies, repair damaged wrappings, replace coffins, write labels, and carry the kings away. A ruler who had spent years preparing one eternal house might be placed in another person's coffin, then moved again, and sometimes moved again after that. The greatest kings of the New Kingdom would travel through the Western Hills as hidden cargo. Their names would be written in ink on linen and wood so that no one would forget which body was which. This was not the eternity they had designed, but it may have been the only eternity left to them. Ramesses XI was the final ruler of the 20th dynasty. His reign was long, but royal power was divided and uncertain. In the south, military leaders and the high priests of Amun held enormous authority. The old royal cemetery could no longer be maintained by the system that had created it. The tombs remained in the cliffs. Some were open, some had been robbed, and some still held royal bodies, but the protection around them was fading. Earlier generations had answered this danger with deeper corridors, stronger doors, hidden entrances, guards, and secrecy. None of it had been enough. Once the location of a tomb was known, repairing the doorway did not make that knowledge disappear. So officials began to separate the king from the tomb. They opened old burials, examined the bodies, and moved them. The short inscriptions written in ink on coffins and mummy wrappings are usually called dockets. Some record an inspection. Some record a restoration or renewed burial. Some name officials, dates, and kings. These are among the quietest documents in the story. A royal monument speaks loudly. It gives the king many titles. It places him before gods. It announces permanence. A docket is practical. This body is the king. This burial was renewed. This work was done in this year, under these authorities. The notes suggest careful administration. The officials understood that movement created a new danger. Once a mummy left its original tomb and coffin, identity could be lost. A body might be placed in a replacement coffin. A coffin might once have belonged to someone else. Wrappings might be renewed with linen supplied from another source. A king's name might need to be written again so that the next group would know whom they were carrying. The process happened over years, not in one dramatic night. Some mummies were moved more than once. A damaged king might first be transferred into another royal tomb for protection. Later, as that place became unsafe, he might be moved again. Bodies were gathered, separated, regrouped, and eventually placed in caches. Of all the surviving names connected with the final years of the royal necropolis, Butahamun is the one we can follow most closely. He was a scribe of the necropolis, born into a family that had served the royal cemetery for generations. His father was a scribe, and the family's surviving letters and graffiti place them inside the final decades of the old necropolis administration. Butahamun did not single-handedly direct every royal reburial, and the surviving evidence does not allow us to turn him into the sole architect of the operation. But he was deeply involved in the work. His titles included Scribe of the Necropolis, and opener of the gates of the necropolis. Other titles connected him with work in the House of Eternity and with the treasuries of kings. Read slowly, they begin to sound less like honors than responsibilities. He opened gates. He entered royal burials. He worked at the moment when the necropolis was being inspected, reorganized, and dismantled. Butehamun also left letters and graffiti behind. One well-known letter is addressed not directly to his dead wife, Iktay, but to her coffin, asking it to carry his words to her and ask how she is. That is the man we glimpse near the end of the old royal cemetery. A man surrounded by the language of death, burial, memory, and practical work. We should be careful with the word saving. It sounds morally clear. The officials saved the kings from robbers, and in one sense they did. Without the removals, many royal bodies may have been destroyed completely, but the operations also involved reuse. Coffins changed owners. Precious materials disappeared. Funerary goods were taken from their original settings. Some gilded surfaces were stripped. Scarce wood, linen, and burial equipment entered new cycles of use. The officials were working inside a changed economy. A coffin made from imported timber remained valuable even without gold. A royal burial contained resources that could be redirected to later elite burials and temple institutions. Protection and appropriation were not always separate actions. A mummy could be rewrapped with care while its original equipment was dismantled. A king could be rescued from a robbed tomb and placed inside a coffin that had already lived another life. The old royal necropolis was becoming an archive of material. Names were read, bodies were identified, containers were reused, and new labels were written. These people were not preserving the Valley of the Kings as a modern archaeological site. They were solving an immediate problem with the tools, beliefs, and needs of their own time. Perhaps for them, the body mattered more than the room. The tomb had failed, but the name and the mummy could still survive. The rituals could be renewed, and the king could be placed among other protected dead. This changed the meaning of royal burial. A pharaoh had once expected a private cosmos made for him alone. Now kings from different centuries traveled together. The father and son, the conqueror and the conquered, the remembered and the almost forgotten. They entered the same darkness. Near the cliffs of Deir el-Bahari, a deep shaft led into the tomb now known as the Deir el-Bahari royal cache. Its earliest use and development remain subjects of study. By the 21st dynasty, it was associated with the family of the high priest Pinigem II and became the final hiding place of an extraordinary group of royal and elite mummies. The location was difficult. The shaft dropped steeply. Below it, passages and chambers disappeared into the rock. One by one, or in groups, coffins were lowered and carried inside. The work must have been exhausting. A royal coffin is not light. Some were built from imported timber, plastered, painted, and once gilded. They had been made to travel in daylight, carried by men in ceremonial dress along a prepared road. Now they disappeared into a narrow shaft beneath the cliffs, one after another, then another, then another. Below, men took the weight and carried them deeper. The coffins accumulated along the corridors and chambers. Some were arranged carefully, others were fitted wherever room remained. Imagine the names passing through their hands. Sekenenra, Ammos, Amenhotep, Thutmose, Seti, and Rameses. To us, those names belong to separate chapters. To the men in the cache, they were bodies and coffins that had to be moved through the dark. Someone checks the ink on the wrappings. Someone repeats a king's identity aloud. Then the coffin disappears further into the passage. Among those eventually found in the royal cache were rulers whose monuments had shaped Egypt's memory of itself. Thutmose III had led campaigns across the Near East. Seti I had built one of the most elaborate royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Ramesses II had filled Egypt with his names and images, ruling so long that generations had known no other king. None of that allowed them to remain in their own tombs. Ramesses II was moved and reburied more than once. His mummy eventually rested in a reused coffin and was hidden with other royal dead. Seti I, whose original alabaster sarcophagus was covered with sacred texts, entered the cache in a far simpler condition than the burial prepared for him. The rulers who had tried hardest to make themselves permanent survived because later people dismantled that permanence. Their tombs were left behind. Their equipment was reduced, altered, or reused. Their bodies traveled without the processions once made for them. But they survived. The cache also held members of the 21st dynasty priestly elite and their families. It was not only a shelter for older kings. It was tied to the people who controlled Thebes in the age when those royal bodies were gathered. Pinegem II, a high priest of Amun, was buried there with close family members. The cache brought together two kinds of power: the kings of the new kingdom, whose empire had faded, and the Theban priestly families who now managed their remains. At some point, the entrance was concealed. The exact final sequence is not fully recoverable. The tomb had been used and revisited over time. Eventually, no one returned. The people who knew the route died. Their children died. The institutions that had ordered the transfers changed. Records were lost or scattered, and the kings disappeared from history once more. The cache remained hidden for almost 3,000 years. Above it, Egypt changed beyond anything the men who sealed it could have imagined. New dynasties ruled. Foreign armies came and went. Temples lost their original functions, and both languages and religions changed. The royal names survived on walls, but their pronunciation was forgotten. The ability to read hieroglyphs disappeared. Villages grew around the ancient landscape. Stone was reused. Tombs became shelters, homes, storerooms, churches, quarries, and sources of objects for trade. Travelers came to Thebes and looked at the ruins. They saw cliffs, broken statues, buried doorways, and fragments of an enormous past. The kings remained below. This is the quietest part of the story because nothing happens that we can see. No official enters the shaft. No thief reaches the corridor. No scribe adds another docket. The linen darkens, wood dries, resins harden, bodies remain where they were placed. The silence of archaeology is sometimes mistaken for safety, but the cache was not protected by magic. It survived because its entrance was hidden well enough, and because knowledge of it was lost. Then, in the 19th century, objects connected to the cache began appearing on the antiquities market. The silence had ended before archaeologists understood why. The modern discovery of the Deir el-Bahari royal cache is connected with the Abd el-Rasul family, who lived in the Theban area and became involved in the antiquities trade. The family appears to have found the cache years before the Egyptian authorities entered it officially in 1881. The exact date and circumstances remain uncertain. Later stories included a lost goat leading someone toward the shaft. It is memorable, and some version of it may be true, but discovery stories often become cleaner each time they are repeated. What is clearer is that funerary objects bearing important names began reaching dealers and collectors during the 1870s. Papyri, statuettes, and parts of coffins, objects belonging to people who should have remained inside an unknown tomb. Officials of the Egyptian Antiquities Service realized that a major burial had been found and was being emptied gradually. Gaston Maspero investigated the trade. Suspicion focused on the Abd el-Rasul family. Family members were questioned and pressured, but for a time the source remained concealed. In 1881, after conflict within the family, the location was revealed to the authorities. Emil Brugsch of the Antiquities Service went to the site with Egyptian colleagues, including Ahmed Kamal. They descended into the shaft. Brugsch went down by rope, carrying a light, following men who had known the place before him. What the light found first may have seemed ordinary. Small funerary figures, vessels, cloth, and fragments of burial equipment, the kind of material found in many disturbed Theban tombs. Then the passage turned, and the light fell on coffins. Not one coffin, a corridor of them, standing and lying along the passage, one behind another, continuing beyond the first reach of the light. Brugsch later described the shock of realizing that he was standing among royal dead. He went farther. There were more coffins in the chamber beyond. Some belonged to kings whose names had been carved into temple walls 3,000 years earlier. The cache contained the remains and funerary equipment of more than 50 royal and elite individuals, including at least 11 pharaohs. Accounts of the clearance also speak of thousands of funerary objects. The exact totals vary according to what is counted as a body, coffin component, or individual object. But the scale was unmistakable. Brugsch had no practical way to secure the place for a long excavation, and the people who had found it before him knew exactly where it was. The discovery was extraordinary. The removal was hurried. Fearing further theft, the Antiquities Service cleared the cache with remarkable speed, commonly described as taking about 2 days of concentrated work. From the perspective of protection, the urgency is understandable. From the perspective of archaeology, it was disastrous. The exact positions of many coffins and objects were not recorded in modern detail. The arrangement of the cache, which might have helped reconstruct the sequence of ancient transfers, was disturbed before it could be documented properly. The kings were saved again, and once again something was lost during the rescue. The coffins were carried from the cliffs and transported north. A famous later account describes people gathering along the Nile as the royal dead passed, with men firing guns and women mourning. The scene has been repeated so often that it has become part of the discovery's legend. Some details may have grown in the telling, but the image remains powerful. The ancient kings were leaving Thebes, not in royal barges, not surrounded by the full ritual of state burial. They traveled as antiquities under guard. Their destination was a museum. There, over the following generations, the mummies were catalogued, photographed, unwrapped, studied, displayed, stored, and moved again. Modern science gave them new forms of examination. Doctors studied bones, teeth, wounds, age, disease, and embalming. Historians compared dockets, coffins, inscriptions, and family relationships. Imaging technology allowed researchers to look beneath wrappings without removing them. But modern attention also continued the long history of opening, moving, and looking. The kings had been disturbed by ancient thieves, handled by officials, hidden in reused coffins, found by local people, removed by the Antiquities Service, unwrapped by scholars, and placed before museum visitors. And in the 21st century, several of the best-known royal mummies were moved once more, from the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square to the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. Their bodies never returned to the private darkness imagined for them. The story of the royal tombs survives because different kinds of writing remained. The Turin Strike Papyrus remembers hungry workers. The Abbott Papyrus remembers an inspection shaped by political rivalry. The Leopold Amherst Papyrus remembers testimony from a tomb robber. The mummy dockets remember bodies moved from one burial to another. None of these texts was written to tell the complete story. Each had an immediate purpose: to record the protest, the inspection, the testimony, or the identity of the mummy. The larger history appears only when the fragments are placed beside one another. A state fails to deliver grain. Workers cross the guard posts, tombs become vulnerable and robbers enter. Officials inspect, suspects confess, royal burials are reopened, and kings are moved. A cache is sealed, centuries pass. A family finds the entrance, officials empty the tomb, and the royal dead enter modern history. It is tempting to arrange these events as a simple decline from order into chaos, but the evidence resists that. The strike was not chaos. The workers demanded that obligations be honored. The investigation was not meaningless. Officials did inspect tombs and identify violations. The reburials were not only looting, they preserved bodies that might otherwise have disappeared. Even the discovery was not simply destruction. The rushed clearance damaged archaeological context, but it also prevented the cash from being dispersed completely through the market. At every stage, people tried to preserve one thing while risking another. The workers protected their families and interrupted royal labor. The officials protected their offices and investigated the dead. The people relocating the mummies protected bodies while dismantling burials. The antiquities officials protected a collection while destroying part of its context. History rarely gives us a clean rescue. It gives us choices made by people who do not know what the future will value. We began tonight with a coffin moving through the dark, a king leaving the tomb made for him, a rope carrying the weight of a body that had once carried the weight of Egypt. The Egyptians who built the royal tombs understood that eternity required maintenance. The dead needed offerings, names needed to be spoken, temples needed land and workers, tombs needed guards, and the body needed protection. Eternity was never passive. It depended on the living. When the kingdom could no longer feed the men who cut the tombs, the first crack was not in the stone. It was in the relationship around it. When officials turned a royal inspection into a political contest, the dead became part of living power. When robbers stripped gold from a mummy, sacred material returned to the market. When later officials carried kings out of their tombs, they admitted that the architecture of eternity had failed. And yet some of the kings survived. Not all of them. Not untouched. Not in the houses they had chosen. Seti I survived without the magnificent chamber made for him. Rameses II survived after repeated transfers and reuse. Amenhotep I survived because later Egyptians repaired and rewrapped his body instead of leaving him where he was. They endured because someone changed the original plan. Perhaps that is the final quiet lesson of the cache. We often imagine permanence as something that never moves. A monument stands, a seal remains closed, a body stays where it was placed. But almost nothing survives that way. Things survive because someone carries, repairs, labels, or hides them, or finds a new place when the old one is no longer safe. The pharaohs wanted private tombs filled with objects, spells, food, and gold. What they received was stranger. They were gathered together, labeled in ink, passed from coffin to coffin, carried through narrow passages by men whose names are mostly lost, and hidden in a tomb that did not belong to most of them. Their eternity did not remain untouched. It was handled, reduced, reused, and saved. Tonight, the Valley of the Kings is quiet again. The passages are empty of the royal bodies they once held. Visitors walk through chambers where funerals ended more than 3,000 years ago. Electric lights reveal walls meant for lamps. Railings protect corridors once guarded by secrecy. The kings are elsewhere. Their tombs survived without them. Their bodies survived without their tombs. And perhaps eternity was never about the tomb. Perhaps it was about whatever could still be carried into the dark.